Hello everyone, my name is Cornelius Deblate and I'm here to present to you the Cuban-American embargo. For 5 decades, the United States and Cuba had a tumultuous relationship. Why? Because of an embargo that was imposed by the United States. As of late, this embargo has made the news recently. In recent events, President Donald Trump announced that he will be reversing some of his predecessor's policies in Cuban relations. Because of this, the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Cuba has once again become complicated. Cuba and the United States had an embargo set up between them about 50 years ago. 50 years later, former President Barack Obama opened diplomatic relations with Cuba. A few years later, President Donald Trump would like to reverse some of the policies of Obama and would like to have a better deal with Cuba. Now, before I get into the points that I presented for this presentation, I would like to give you a brief history of the embargo. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba from President Batista and created a socialist government. Castro then aligned himself with the USSR due to trade restrictions from the United States. In 1960, President Eisenhower authorized the stoppage of U.S. exports to Cuba. In 1961, the United States officially breaks diplomatic relations with Cuba. The failed attempt to overthrow Castro was authorized by President Kennedy. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. This was when an American spy plane discovered missile silos in Cuba pointed to the United States. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the Cuban missiles if President Kennedy agreed to dismantle the missiles in Turkey pointed to Russia. In 1963, President Kennedy forbids American travel to Cuba or making any financial trades. In 1977, the embargo was briefly loosened under President Carter. In 1982, President Reagan retightened the embargo. In 1996, the Helms-Burton Act was passed. This further tightened the embargo and is very criticized by humanitarian groups and many foreign governments. More on that later. In 2009, President Obama loosens travel restrictions on Cuba, allowing educational and religious travel. In 2014, President Obama loosens the travel ban even further by allowing chartered flights from the United States to Cuba and back. In 2015, the United States restored diplomatic relations with Cuba. In 2017, President Trump reverses President Obama's policies towards Cuba, thus tightening economic relations, but diplomatic relations are still open. So, what are the effects of the American-Cuban embargo? In this presentation, I would like to talk about the economical effects to both the United States and Cuba, and how the politics behind it affected both Cuba and the United States. And finally, I would like to talk about the social effects of the embargo towards both countries. Now, how was the Cuban economy during the Cold War? I will only be covering from the 50s. After Castro took over, he imposed socialist economic policies in Cuba, similar to the USSR. Now, in Cuba, the per capita income was $374. The average industrial wage was $120 per month. Wage proportion was unequal for the middle class. A large percentage of the populace were squatters, renters, and sharecroppers. 95% of people living in the cities had electricity, and 80% had running water. 90% of people living in the rural areas had no access to both. Now, how was the American economy during the Cold War? Again, I'm just covering from the 50s. After the Second World War, the American economy boomed. The United States became a leader in global exports, especially to those countries that were deeply affected in World War II, such as Germany and Japan. Imports were increased again to those countries that were affected in World War II. Now, during this time, the American government discouraged consumer savings, but encouraged consumer spending. I guess this is what led to the American economy boom during the 50s. And, unlike Cuba, the United States had many allies where finances can flow in and flow out. Now, how about the politics? In Cuba, Fidel Castro already had relations with the Soviet Union before his revolution. During his reign, Castro nationalized all U.S.-owned businesses. Now, this was before he took over. He provided universal health care, public education, and eliminated racism. However, he did ban newspapers, private businesses, and controlled land ownership. Everything was controlled by the government. In the United States, however, the United States had many presidents which had a common goal of stopping the Soviets from expanding. The United States made many allies to counter the USSR, such as joining NATO and the United Nations. It made many federal departments which made to help the American populace, such as the Department of Education. However, in the United States, there was still the element of racism and McCarthyism, which were rife throughout the country. Finally, I would like to talk about the social effect of Cuba and the United States. In Cuba, because of the strict restrictions, the Cuban government is just now relaxing on its policies. It was not until 2010 that the Cuban people can finally own their own businesses. According to Amnesty International, food and medicine shortages are plenty. Now, because of this, Cuba relies heavily on imports for its food, medicines, and manufactured goods. The United States, however, because of the travel embargo, American tourist travel has been restricted and loosened and restricted again since the imposition. Now, just mind you, the United States and Cuba are just 90 miles apart. When the embargo was imposed, it cost the United States $1.2 billion per year in lost sales and exports. And again, because of the strict government sanctions imposed in Cuba, many of the Cuban people escaped, thus becoming refugees and escaping to the United States. In conclusion, the Cuban embargo was made as a way to prevent communism and socialism spreading to the United States. Since then, the embargo has had an unfair effect to Cuba. There have been many attempts to loosen and tighten over the many decades. Since 1959, this embargo is still going on. And I really hope that in the future, this embargo will be lifted. Once again, guys, my name is Cornelius Tablate, and thank you for listening.